Hello and welcome to Unacademy, a one stop destination for the English medium civil services aspirants. Welcome to the daily Hindu analysis. Just for today and tomorrow, we are having the Hindu analysis in the evening due to unavoidable circumstances. So let's start the discussion by first looking at the topics that we are going to discuss. From the Delhi edition, I have picked a lot of important articles. Today's newspaper is dominated by articles related to international relations, economy, and security. So let's cover these 11 topics that are important for your prelims and mains in a comprehensive manner so that you don't have to go back and read the newspaper again. But before we start, I have a very important announcement. As Unacademy is marking its 10th anniversary, we are providing a 50% off on all our IAS courses. And the offer also includes other benefits. You will get free double validity. That is, if you take a 6 month subscription, you get an additional 6 month subscription free of cost. Same for 9 months, 12 months, and 18 months. You also get CSE Assure if you avail a subscription of more than 2 years, which is if you, let's say, you don't clear prelims or the exam for some reason, then Unacademy will provide you a free extension to help you prepare for your next attempt. So all these offers are part of this celebration. And this offer, I'm told, is ending tonight. So this might be your last chance to avail the best possible offer. And those interested, please click on the link provided in the description. And don't forget, you have to enter the code IAS English in order to avail the discount and these offers. So do check out by clicking on the link provided in the video description. And if you want the PDF of the session, please join our official Telegram channel. After the session ends, we will be sharing the PDF over here. So let's get started and look at the first topic. On page number 6 and page number 7, there are two columns in today's paper that examine the national security strategy that was recently brought out by the United States. The US has published a new national security strategy, and this document, which is going to guide American foreign policy and security policy, it obviously has implications for the entire world, from India to Europe. For every region, the American national security strategy will have some impact or the other. So let's try to break down these topics in complete detail. Let's understand what provisions are contained in the national security strategy. Why has it caused a lot of concern and alarm, especially for Europe and even for India? So, first, let's understand what is this document. The National Security Strategy of the US. It's a guideline which is brought out by the US government. It is approved by the US Congress as well. So, it has congressional backing and it is drafted by the administration, primarily by the White House, with the involvement of the National Security Council. So, this guideline, it serves as a template to guide the foreign policy and the security policy of the United States. So this document is brought out every once in a while, usually every couple of years. Sometimes the time period changes as well. But this document basically serves as a guide for the US administrators, for the US military, the US intelligence, the US State Department, and the other branches of the US government to conduct their foreign policy and their security policy. So it's not that US will follow each and every point mentioned in the strategy. It's more of a guide, it's more of a template which serves as a reference for policymakers in the US and the administrators to implement their foreign policy and security policy. So there are chances that a government might deviate from what is outlined in the national security strategy as well, depending on global developments. There have been instances where the US administration has often deviated from what is stated in the national security strategy. For example, in 1990, senior George Bush, right, he had brought out his national security strategy. But the world dynamics changed completely with the fall of the Berlin Wall and reunification of Germany and the eventual end of the Cold War and collapse of Soviet Union. The world order had completely changed. So the 1990 national security strategy of the US became irrelevant. So subsequent changes were made in the new strategies that came out in 91 and 92. So what I'm saying is this document may not be implemented in its entirety. That's why I said it's more of a guide to provide a reference for the US government and the administrators to run the foreign policy and security policy of the country. It can undergo changes as well, it can adapt depending on global developments. But however, we need to take this document very, very seriously. I can't stress how important it is to treat this document seriously because this marks a complete departure from the United States with regard to its foreign policy and approach towards the global world order. See, the current international order that you have was largely framed and constructed in the post World War era, which was driven under US leadership. Post 1945, the new world order that was created, it was under the leadership of the United States itself, where new institutions were created, such as United Nations, the Bretton Woods institutions, such as World Bank, IMF, would take the lead to regulate the global banking and financial sectors. And in almost every aspect, the US was assuming a leadership position for the last 70, 75 odd years when it came to all the important global affairs and global matters. Be it a conflict, be it an economic crisis or a disaster, US would be in that leadership position to try and assist other countries or play a role keeping in mind its own interests, its own self-interests. Either ways, the US was always present, omnipresent across the world, from East Asia to South Asia, from Latin America to the Pacific, from West Asia to Central Asia. In every nook and corner of the world, US started playing a big role. It would get involved in regime change operations. It would get involved in sponsoring covert operations using proxy wars. It would also assist some of its allies by providing them funds, assistance, weapons, and even technology. So this is how the US came to dominate the world order. And especially after the decline and collapse of Soviet Union, post the end of the Cold War, the US became a sole superpower, almost turning the world into a unipolar world for a brief period. But today, Trump is taking a direct hit at the very foundation of American foreign policy. That's how it appears. I was going through this document, it's around 33 pages in total. Most of the focus of the document is on US relations with Europe. European powers are quite alarmed by what the strategy is talking about. See, over the last 1 year, ever since Trump assumed office for the second time, I'm sure all of you have seen how Trump and his administration officials have been making controversial statements regarding Europe's role as far as the Atlantic geopolitics are concerned. For example, J.D. Vance, the vice president, he attended the Munich Security Conference a few months ago, and he openly lambasted the European leaders. And the entire focus was on how Europe had eroded itself by focusing on liberalism and free values and free society, how it had allowed rampant migration to occur, which had allowed primarily Asian migrants, Muslims from West Asia, and others to enter into Europe. He took direct pot shots about the lack of focus from European countries on defense and security, which to some extent is true as well. European nations have been complacent when it comes to their own security. They haven't spent enough on their military modernization and their military preparedness. And that is what primarily allows countries like Russia to get aggressive. And what you're seeing in Ukraine is not just a result of Russian aggression, it's also a result of the weakness of Europe and the weakness of the European Union in terms of the defense and security of the region. So one big complaint of Donald Trump has been that US has been putting the bill for the security of Europe through NATO, through the NATO military alliance. So now Trump's argument, even during his presidential campaign days, was that why should US handle European security? Why should US pump in more money, troops, and resources? Why aren't European countries spending enough? He has even threatened to dismantle NATO entirely. See, under NATO, countries are expected to spend at least 2% of their GDP on defense spending. so that through NATO, collective defense can be arranged. But the fact that US was expected to bear the higher burden is what led to this friction between the Trump administration and the European countries. But until now, all these rhetoric and statements by American leaders, it was being largely dismissed. European countries would assume that this is a phase, it will pass, that maybe Trump may not be in office for long, right? He's old enough, or there might be a change in the approach of the US government. So there was that complacency which was still present. But now the national security strategy makes it very clear that Europe will not get the support it was getting from the US. In fact, the NSS talks about civilizational erasure of Europe. Basically, the US is hinting that Europe has eroded its own civilization by allowing for free migration, entry of refugees and migrants, by going easy on even illegal migrants. And it also takes a shot at the European Union for promoting free liberal values, which has been the very core tenet of the European Union and the success of the EU as a common market and a trading entity. So this poses multiple challenges for Europe today. See, European countries have very limited choices in front of them. Until now, they always relied on US being there holding their back. But now with US almost turning hostile, right? Because the document even hints at making possible changes in European politics, which is almost a call for interference in the internal affairs of European nations. The NSS talks about US supporting the right wing parties and far right wing entities which are rising up, which includes few neo Nazi factions as well, which is quite alarming and dangerous. From Italy to Germany to France, across Europe, on anti immigration sentiments, there is a lot of rise in neo-Nazi sentiments and far right-wing ideology. And US seems to be extending some sort of ideological support for this cause. If not explicitly, that is what you can infer from the national security strategy. So that hints towards possible US involvement in the politics of Europe to back and support these far right-wing parties which can deal with these problems and focus on European security and defense. It even possibly indicates that maybe US will try to push for regime change of the current leaderships and governments. And that is what is scary for European countries. And as a result, the options for these European leaders today are very limited. As I said, some countries have tried pleasing Donald Trump, trying to flatter Donald Trump, trying to appeal to his ego. That's what UK has been doing. It's the similar model which even Philippines, Vietnam, and even South Korea has followed with regard to the trade deals that they have worked out with the US, trying to please the ego of Donald Trump and offer investments and lucrative trade deals and contracts to American businesses in order to win favorable support from the Trump administration. So UK has taken this path under Keir Starmer. Germany was initially openly opposing such policies of Donald Trump. The German chancellor, he was calling for Germany being independent in its foreign policy. And he was taking a stand against American bullying tactics under the Trump administration. But now Germany is also falling in line. Germany has started buying American weapons in large quantities as it seeks to remilitarize and rearm itself to deal with Russian threats. Then you look at other countries, France, Italy. Most of them are either looking to please the Trump administration, or some of them are ignoring it altogether, hoping it's a phase, it will pass away, that policy will change eventually. And the third option that they are going to face is to be autonomous, be independent, take ownership of their own responsibilities, and take a stand against the US if needed, or at least to some extent delineate themselves from the US and ensure that European interests are protected. So different countries are taking different paths. While some are trying to appease Donald Trump, please his ego, some are trying to ignore it for now, but some are trying to recalibrate their approach and policies. For example, Denmark has recently made a big shift. Just a few days ago, after the NSS was published, the Danish intelligence, they have classified United States as a security threat because they believe that now US might covertly interfere to support certain parties, right-wing political organizations to rise to power, which could mean political interference from the US with aim to engineer regime change. So some countries are taking up their guard against the US, while some are trying to take these different approaches. But one thing is very clear, that now Europe will face getting irrelevant in geopolitics if they do not wake up and if they do not deal with the new challenges being posed, especially by America's policies. Now, if you look at Trump's NSS, the document appears almost like a trade document more than a security document. It brings back the colonial era mindset, the imperial kind of policies. There is more focus on Africa, parts of Asia, but primarily Trump's focus and priority is the Western Hemisphere. He's talking about the Americas region, North America and South America, being the primary focus of United States. Until now, US had a global area of interest. In every nook and corner of the world, US was interested. But now, US is redrawing those boundaries and lines. It's almost like a revision of the Monroe Doctrine of 1823. In 1823, the then US president had brought out the Monroe Doctrine, which had given a warning to European colonial powers to stay away from colonization of Americas, to stay away from interfering in the Americas region and allow the Americas to be dominated by the United States. Under the Monroe Doctrine, the US had clearly said if European colonial powers like Britain, Portugal, Spain, or any other European power were to interfere in the Americas or colonize any part of North or South America, then US would treat this as a hostile threat. It was through the Monroe Doctrine that US carved out the Western Hemisphere for itself, kept the Europeans away, and managed to dominate the western part of the world. So now the NSS is giving a call for retaining American primacy and dominance in the Western Hemisphere. Now, what does this mean? This could also mean that US is probably okay to make deals with Russia and China, the current major global powers, and allow them to retain their influence in their strategic backyards. As long as Russia, China promise not to interfere in the Western Hemisphere, in the Americas region, most likely the Trump administration is okay to allow Russia, China to carve out their own spheres of influence. So, what will Russia do? Russia will carve out Europe and the Atlantic and parts of Arctic and West Asia as its sphere of influence. What would China do? China will try to carve out parts of Pacific, Indian Ocean, and Africa as its primary area of influence. So this sort of an arrangement, it's a reminder of the colonial imperial policies where colonial powers would divide the world as if it was their own property. Now, this is detrimental to the interests of smaller powers. Some of you might have heard that there are rumors of a new grouping called the C5. It's being rumored that the NSS, the draft version of this document, contained a proposal called C5, Core 5, a group of 5 countries, that is US, Russia, China, India, and Japan. This was projected as a replacement of the G7 by excluding the European powers. And these countries could decide global affairs. But US has dismissed these rumors. The US has officially said that there is no proposal for a C5. But however, still, if you consider this possibility, because looking at Trump's erratic policies and disruptive policies, such a proposal is very likely. Now, some of you might think India's inclusion is great news for us, that we are also being considered as a major power. But trust me, in any such arrangement, which is exclusionary and elitist, powers like US and China would dominate and they would expect India to fall in line. There would be conditions on India. We have already seen how Trump is a transactional leader, how he has threatened India and leveraged the American trade power and used 50% tariffs on India as a leverage, as a bargaining chip in the ongoing trade negotiations. He has been exerting pressure on India to cut off its oil imports from Russia and also seeking a lot of other economic concessions which could hurt our core sectors in the economy. So, such threats and bullying tactics will likely increase. It will continue. And for middle powers like India, it will become extremely challenging. because we have always placed faith in our multilateral systems. The UN might be imperfect, WTO might be problematic, there might be a lot of loopholes and shortcomings in the current global order, but still, that is the best possible system that we at least have, where even the small, weaker powers can raise their voice. But what Trump is envisioning is a group of elites, a group which will favor certain interests of rich conglomerates, rich corporations, billionaires, and which suits the interests of only few elitist powers. And for a country like India, this will never work for our cause. In a grouping like this, or even let's say C5 is not proposed, let's say a group where US, China, Russia make these informal arrangements and carve out the world into different hemispheres and spheres of influence. Where does that leave India? That is the big question. Because the entire NSS document of 33 pages, it barely makes a mention of India. The references to India is very, very limited. There are some references, we will discuss that, but the references are very limited. That shows the position that India occupies in America's worldview. This is a big shift in the last 2 decades. From 2005 to 2025, India US relations have taken a complete nosedive. It's taken a complete U turn, and for the worse. That is why this article on page 7 is very important. This column written by Amitabh Mattu, a well known intellectual and geopolitical expert who has been part of the National Security Advisory Board as well. He was also part of a delegation that worked out the India US nuclear deal, which was a big milestone under Prime Minister Manmohan Singh. So, Amitabh Mattu is of the opinion that Trump's policies and the national security strategy, which has been brought out, is a direct attack on the foundation of India US relations itself. It marks a complete departure from what US promised in 2005 and what they are doing now, 20 years later. So, what did US promise in 2005? In 2005, we saw a complete shift in India US relations. In fact, it started in early 2000s under Prime Minister Vajpayee. The 9/11 attacks was a turning point when US invaded Afghanistan with the international coalition force. They needed counterterrorism support from India. So what started as a security military based relationship quickly transformed into a strategic partnership. And the 2005 nuclear deal was a landmark breakthrough which ended the nuclear pariah status of India's nuclear program. US promised full support to India's entry into export control regimes like Nuclear Suppliers Group and MTCR and Wassenaar Arrangement and Australia Group. Then US promised to help India rise as a strategic power, as a regional and global power, and act as a counterweight to China in the Indo Pacific. Now, this was not a mere promise, it was a recognition from the US that India has risen, that India has its own economic military capabilities, that India should be treated as an equal partner with equal respect. It was not an ordinary buyer-seller relationship that was being proposed. That's when US started supplying advanced weaponry to India, including the possibility of transfer of technology, joint research projects, joint ventures. So it came to such an extent that US labeled this relationship as the most defining diplomatic partnership of the 21st century. The two largest democracies working together to stabilize the world, to stabilize Indo-Pacific, and to keep China under check. Now, this was working perfectly for India's interests. India's biggest concern in the Indo-Pacific has been the rise of China, China's aggression, China's expansionism, and its disregard for global rules-based order. So US was not only propping up India as a puppet. India was not just a puppet, but an equal partner which would work and align with the US, and US would assist India in return, and US was recognizing that role of India. And that is what was important for us in the Indo-Pacific. But today, Trump is relegating India to just another power with main focus on trade and supply of weapons, nothing more. Which means Trump expects countries like India and other small powers to take ownership of their own responsibilities in the region, whether it is fair or unfair, doesn't matter. So this will apply for climate change talks as well, right? Trump's policies would again push countries like India to take ownership of our emissions and contribute more to climate action, which is completely unfair and against the principles of equity. Trump would definitely push India to handle China largely on its own. Yes, the US needs India even today for that balance in the Indo Pacific, but India cannot expect that equal treatment. Trump looks at India as a weaker subordinate partner, meaning we will have to compromise on our political choices. We may have to compromise on our strategic autonomy, which is the foundation of our foreign policy. So, as long as India stays independent in its foreign policy approach, Trump is likely to target India using trade as a leverage. Trump could push India to end the strategic ties with Russia. So, these are the various complications which might come up. Right? Trump could push India to make a compromise on the Palestine issue and the two-state solution. Trump could push India to make deals with Pakistan. And given how Trump has been using the closeness with the Pakistani establishment, even after Operation Sindoor, has been a matter of concern for India. In fact, the NSS document is largely praising Trump. In fact, the initial few pages, it's all about praising Trump for what he has done, for the remarkable changes he has brought about. And he also claims all the peace agreements he has worked out and the ceasefires he has mediated. They make a mention of India Pakistan ceasefire as well, though India denies any American involvement. So this shows that India's concerns are likely to get crushed. And that is where the challenge will lie for India as well. So in a way, India, Europe, they find themselves on the same page when it comes to United States. This reminds me of a very popular statement. Henry Kissinger, the former NSA and Secretary of State of the US, used to state that it's more dangerous to be a friend of America than being an enemy of America. Because America has a habit of backstabbing its friends and allies. That's what Europe and India are learning now from the policies of Donald Trump. So this is a strategy of the US which is likely to have a lasting effect. Because under President Barack Obama in 2009, US had recalibrated its approach towards Indo-Pacific. The pivot to Asia policy. The pivot to Asia policy of 2009 led to US rebalancing its diplomatic and military posture towards Indo-Pacific to counter China. And in this in this plan, India played a big role where it would act as an equal partner of the US to balance China in the region. So now Trump is retreating from these regions. Trump wants to retreat from Asia, retreat from Europe and other parts of the world, and only look at trade interests, almost like a mercantile approach, looking at only the economic interests of American businesses to make America great again, to bring back jobs and create manufacturing base back in the US, and leave the Americas region for US alone to dominate. That is North and South America region, including Central America, to be dominated only by the US. So that is where the problems and challenges lies for India and Europe. So please take up a practice question based on what we have discussed. And also, if you want a detailed video on this, please let me know in the comments. I was thinking about a separate video, short video, maybe 30, 40 minutes, because there are some more details which we have to look at. So if you want an exclusive video on national security strategy of the US and its impact on India, please let me know in the comments. If there is enough students asking for it, I might consider doing it in the next couple of days. Now let's move on to the next topic. The government of India has pushed a very important bill in the parliament in the ongoing winter session, the Shanti Bill. So let's quickly break down the provisions of the bill and what does it entail, and we'll carry out a critical assessment of the Shanti Bill. Shanti stands for Sustainable Harnessing and Advancement of Nuclear Energy for Transforming India. The Modi government has a penchant for acronyms. They're two very clever acronyms. So this is a bill focusing on the nuclear energy sector, the civilian nuclear sector. The bill proposes to repeal two very important laws: the Atomic Energy Act of 1962, which until now provided the legislative and the regulatory framework for atomic energy in the country. It's because of the Atomic Energy Act that the nuclear sector was treated as a public sector. Only government entities could play a role in the nuclear sector with no scope for private participation. And the Atomic Energy Regulatory Board and the Atomic Energy Commission, they draw their powers from this law, and they are the regulators of the nuclear sector. So the nuclear sector in India, the nuclear energy sector, was entirely government owned, government controlled, government regulated under the provisions of this old law. Then we also had the Civil Liability for Nuclear Damages Act of 2010, the law which provided for compensation to the victims of a nuclear disaster. If nuclear power plants are set up, if an accident or a tragedy occurs, in that case, who will pay for the compensation to the victims? To decide the liability, this law was enacted with the parliament, the Civil Liability for Nuclear Damage Act 2010. So these two laws are being repealed by the Shanti Bill. The Shanti Bill, once it becomes a law, it's going to replace these two legislations. Now, let me explain the focus on the nuclear energy sector in India. These points are very, very important. India has very ambitious plans for nuclear energy. Because, see, nuclear energy is clean and relatively safe. Though there is a big risk of nuclear accidents occurring, due to the advancement in technology, it is considered as a relatively safer technology today, and it is highly clean technology, right? And it's not something which will get exhausted very soon. Though not exactly renewable, but it does fall under the bracket because of the longevity of uranium and the clean nature of the industry, right? The lack of emissions. It is perfect for decarbonizing your economy to replace your coal based thermal power plants. So, in our energy basket, if you look at the diversification of our energy sources, nuclear energy today occupies a significant share in India's energy basket. India's ambition is to have 100 gigawatts of nuclear energy by 2047. 2047 is when India hopes to become a Viksit developed Bharat. By then, the goal is to have 100 gigawatts of installed capacity in nuclear sector. As of today, 3% of our electricity is coming from nuclear power plants. According to data from 2024-2025, 3% of the total electricity which is being produced in our country is coming from nuclear energy. So the plan is to scale up investments in nuclear power plants. And recently, the government has started prioritizing small modular reactors. In the recent budget, Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman has rolled out a dedicated program with dedicated funding and incentives to promote the rollout of small modular reactors in the country, to decentralize nuclear power plants. And by 2033, the goal is to have at least 5 to 6 small modular reactors which become operational in the country. So, to enable this, the government is looking at private sector participation in the nuclear energy sector, and it is liberalizing the nuclear energy industry. The stranglehold the government had on nuclear sector is being liberalized with a role for private sector being envisioned. So, under the Shanti Bill, though the sector would be regulated by the public sector, there is a push for joint ventures and public private partnerships with private industries, with private players. Most likely, the preference would be for domestic private players to invest in nuclear plants, to procure fuel from abroad, and to operate the nuclear plants in the country. So, a role for private players is being envisioned in the Shanti Bill. Though the sector will be regulated by the public sector, private entities can collaborate, enter into joint ventures with public entities like Nuclear Power Corporation of India Limited, and set up public private partnership projects to help bring private capital and technology, to mobilize more capital and technology. So there is a scope for foreign investment as well, but most likely preference would be for domestic private players to play a bigger role. The foreign involvement would be most likely in the form of technology, fuel, and reactor technology. So India would try to create a framework where foreign vendors and equipment manufacturers will supply the reactors and technology to India. And we have civil nuclear deals with many countries to ensure uranium supply as well. So, most likely, foreign involvement might be limited to that, with some projects being handed over to foreign entities, like how Russia is building the Kundun nuclear operators to set up their plants in India and operate their plants in the country. So, maybe there will be a carving out of the space for some foreign involvement, but greater preference for domestic private players with overall control by the public sector. This is the structure being envisioned under the Shanti Bill. Now, under the Shanti Bill, apart from the liberalization and the greater role for private sector, there are some concerns which have come up, especially with regard to nuclear liability. In the event of a nuclear tragedy, in the event of a nuclear disaster, what will happen? Who will be liable for the damages and the compensation? Not just for compensating victims, but even for remediating the environmental damage. Right? The environment ecosystem will suffer significant damage, which will require significant investments to remediate in the long term. So, who will pay for this? Who will be held accountable? Now, to understand this, first we have to look at the Civil Liability Nuclear Damage Act of 2010. What provisions did it contain? See, when it comes to nuclear liability, there is an international standard established by the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA. The IAEA has a set of standards with regard to civil liability, and IAEA recommends that there should be a maximum cap on the liability of the operator and the supplier, meaning they can't be opened for unlimited liability. So let's say a foreign company like Westinghouse or General Electric, they have supplied a reactor to India, and there is an unfortunate accident after many years. Now, it would be incorrect to hold the supplier accountable for an operational error or for a natural disaster, maybe. And what if there was no intent to commit such negligence? Right? Do accidents do happen? So, keeping that in mind and to encourage greater private participation, IAEA has kept the standard that there should be a capping limit with regard to what is the liability that operator will pay, to what extent supplier would be made liable, and rest of it should be taken by the concerned government. Beyond a certain limit, liability will not be on operator or supplier. It will be on the concerned government. This is what IAEA expects. The then Manmohan Singh government was willing to be aligned with IAEA standards. Though India had made a big commitment under the India-US nuclear deal, right? Part of the deal was that US companies would be encouraged to invest in India. French companies would also enter India's nuclear sector. So, to enable the foreign involvement to scale up our nuclear sector, we had to abide by the global standards, the IAEA standards. And the government was willing to do that. But when the bill was proposed in the parliament, it was very strongly opposed by almost all the political parties. Why? Because of India's experience, the Bhopal gas tragedy, one of the world's largest industrial disaster, where the operator of the plant was hardly held liable, and eventually the victims had to suffer. Even today, they are running around pillar and post to get their compensation. So, given the experience of the Bhopal gas tragedy, there was a lot of political pressure, and the bill was amended at the last minute. The amendment was done in such a way that it has placed a higher degree of liability on the operator of the plant, and a legal recourse is provided where the supplier of the equipment can be sued for additional compensation. Now, this is not recommended by IAEA. If there is a legal recourse available, if victims can sue not just the operator for more compensation beyond the given limit, if they can also sue the supplier, then this could become a big disincentive for the operators and the suppliers. They will not even enter the sector. One reason why American and French companies have still not set up a nuclear plant in India, despite all the agreements, is because of this law, because it was not aligned with global standards. But the parliament felt it was necessary to protect Indians, ensure there is greater compensation to them in case of a nuclear tragedy, to hold these operators and suppliers accountable if the tragedy occurs. So there was a mismatch between India's legislation and the global standards, and this became a trade barrier, a barrier for foreign nuclear suppliers to play a role in India's nuclear market. So there has been a lot of pressure from US and other countries to simplify this law and meet the global standards so that they can sell nuclear technology to India. And that is what the Shanti Bill is seeking to do. Some are praising the bill for simplifying the liability norms and meeting the global standards. But there is criticism as well, because this would make Indians vulnerable in case of a nuclear event, in case of a nuclear disaster. Under the new bill, liability is being capped by the government at 3,000 crores, and that too only for the operator of the plant. Supplier will not be liable in case of a nuclear disaster. There are exceptions. I'll explain the exceptions. But in case of a nuclear tragedy, supplier will not be automatically liable to pay any compensation. Up to 3,000 crore compensation will be paid by the operator of the plant. Beyond this, if compensation has to be given, then government will bear the compensation. Any excess liability will be borne by the government, which means taxpayers' money will be used to compensate. That is where the criticism comes up. What if a supplier had been negligent in the design and manufacturing of the plant? And what if that led to a tragedy? Right? So there is a recourse which is given, but this is dependent on a contract being signed between supplier and operator. If at all operator has a pre-existing contract with supplier, which states that if there is a negligence on the part of the supplier or a deliberate intent to cause a nuclear disaster, or if supplier has agreed to pay some compensation, only then supplier can be held liable. Only then victims can sue the supplier for additional compensation if there is a contract between operator and supplier, or else supplier is completely immune. Even if there is a defect or negligence on the supplier's part, they will not be held liable for compensation. Only operator will pay up to 3,000 crores, which is obviously not enough. Rest of it will be paid by government using taxpayers' money. This is where the criticism comes up, that we are weakening the liability standards. But the counter argument is that this will bring our liability law in line with global standards of IAEA. This will allow foreign players to play a role. One reason why foreign players are not entering Indian market is because they are worried about the liability that they'll get opened up to. So the government is trying to simplify the regime and encourage greater foreign participation. But the concern remains that in case of a nuclear disaster, victims will again face the brunt. Taxpayers' money will be used to compensate, even if there has been a mistake by the supplier or the operator, because the maximum cap is 3,000 crores. The bill does recommend insurance and financial security, but this has to be arranged by the operator. This is mandatory. The operator of a plant should mandatorily get insurance and ensure financial security of the company. But again, supplier has no other obligation apart from this. Only if there is a contract between operator and supplier, only then supplier can be held accountable and a legal recourse can be taken by the victims to sue the supplier. Or else there is no way you can hold the supplier accountable. Then coming to the security of our nuclear cycle, because nuclear material can be easily leaked and diverted and proliferated towards weapons technology, right? That's where the government is keeping a tight control over the supply chain. In the bill, if you look at the provisions with regard to the fuel cycle and with regard to the management of the entire fuel supply chain, government will hold full control. Private sector will only be given a limited role, only to set up a plant, operate it, generate electricity. Rest of it, especially the fuel part of it, would be entirely under the sector control of the public sector. So this is good with regard to our non-proliferation commitment. With regard to non-proliferation standards, the bill has sufficient safeguards to prevent nuclear material from falling into the wrong hands. Then finally, one last concern is the independence and autonomy of our regulators in the nuclear sector. See, the regulators in the sector are Atomic Energy Commission, Atomic Energy Regulatory Board, but they are all controlled by the government itself. Their appointments and every other aspect of the functioning of these regulatory bodies is controlled entirely by the government. So this represents a conflict of interest. Usually in countries you have independent regulators in nuclear sector which are autonomous from the government. But in the case of India, the regulators are controlled by the government. It's part of the government itself. So this is one issue which has not been addressed by the bill, and experts are criticizing this. The lack of regulatory independence is being criticized. So this is the short analysis of the Shanti Bill, and please take up this mains practice question. I hope the topic is clear to everyone. Now, moving on, a few quick updates and some interesting analysis from remaining articles. Let's take a look at them. With regard to the Bondi Beach shooting incident, which happened, that the brutal, gruesome terror attack against the Jewish community in Australia. Initially, the attackers, Sajid Akram and his son, Naveed Akram, they were reported to be of Pakistani origin. Even initial sources from Australian police and intelligence and several credible media reports labeled Sajid Akram as a Pakistani citizen who had migrated to Australia as a student, then converted to a PR status. And his son, Naveed Akram, who was born in Australia, was, of course, an Australian citizen. So this pointed towards Pakistani links in the attack. But a day later, fresh clarification has come out from Australia, from Philippines, and from India that Sajid Akram is not from Pakistan. He's an Indian citizen from Hyderabad. And that is the big shocker, a big shocking development for India. Sajid Akram was from Hyderabad. He left India back in 1998. He had a brief stint in Saudi Arabia. Then he almost abandoned his family, went to Australia, settled in Australia. And immigration authorities and intelligence agencies in India, which are now tracking down this case, they have found out that he came to India 6 times in the past 2 decades plus. That too only to settle property matters and sometimes just to meet his parents. But he didn't even come when his father passed away. He has never come back to see his ailing mother. So he had broken all ties and contacts with his family in Hyderabad. But the extent of his links with India or any local modules in India is something that raises concerns. Because just a month before the attack happened, Sajid Akram and his son, they both traveled to Philippines, where Islamic State has a very active presence. And that is something which is very concerning. So now Indian agencies are looking into whether Sajid Akram had any probable links with any local ISIS modules in India. You need to get to the bottom of this, given the nature of this attack which has happened. So the point is, why is Philippines a hub for Islamic State? That is something you need to understand. Now that his identity, his nationality has been established, there will be pressure from Australia for India to cooperate with further investigation. India will more than willingly to do it. Right? From our law enforcement agencies to intelligence agencies, will actively cooperate with Australia and other authorities, and we will be willing to share information. So India will get to the bottom of this as well, and there are implications for our counterterrorism efforts. But the point is, why Philippines is in the picture? Why did Sajid Akram, Navid Akram visit Philippines just a month before the attack? See, as reported, ISIS flags were found in the cars of these attackers. So, which links the attack with Islamic State's ideology. And in Philippines, in the southern part of Philippines, there is an island, the Mindanao Island, which has been a hub of extremist terrorist activity from many, many years. Philippines is a Christian majority nation. Almost 80% of the country's population, they are Roman Catholics. But in southern Philippines, there is one small region, the Mindanao region, which is a largely Muslim dominated region. Almost, I think, 8% of Philippines population happens to be Muslims. So there is a standing dispute over here in this region, ethno-religious dispute and conflict, where the Moro people are fighting for their independence. It's a ethno-religious conflict going on in southern Philippines. The Moro people who belong to the Moro ethnicity, most of them are Muslims here. The most of the Moros, who belong to this unique ethnic group, they are Muslims. And because of the divisions, the ethnic and religious divisions, they have been fighting for an independent state over here. And they have taken up armed resistance against Philippines. Now, the persistence of violence over here has given space for jihadist ideology to flourish. Even Al Qaeda had a presence over here. Some of the rebellion groups, they have taken up jihadist ideology and they have been engaging in terrorism from a long time in this region. So, Al Qaeda also had a presence. And today, the groups operating in Mindanao have shifted their affiliation to Islamic State. And ISIS has a significant presence in the southern islands of Philippines. This is something you need to note down. So India would be closely looking at these links. And are there any other ISIS modules in India which may have connections with the ISIS hotspot in Philippines? That is something we will try to investigate. Next, on page number 8, there's a detailed article on the future of governance in the Maoist areas as India is on the verge of defeating Maoism. We have studied in previous sessions that India is setting an ambitious goal to ensure that we have a Naxal Mukt Bharat by March 2026. We want to get rid of left wing extremism, and India has been doing pretty well in this regard. The top leadership has almost been wiped out. Hundreds and hundreds of Naxals are surrendering, almost bringing the movement to an end. So, most experts believe that by next year, Naxalism might become irrelevant. If not completely defeated, it might become completely irrelevant and dormant. So, this raises a very important question. What will India do with regard to governance and administration in these Maoist held areas? If you look at the history of Maoism, the ideology of Maoism, it is rooted in exploiting the perceived notions of farmers, peasants, tribals, and workers. They are the main target base for Maoist ideology. So, if you look at the Naxal heartland, the red corridor of India from Bihar, West Bengal to Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, Odisha, Telangana, Maharashtra, in this entire red corridor, the tribal issue, especially in Dandakaranya region of Chhattisgarh and Odisha, has been a prime reason which has contributed to the rise of Maoist ideology. When Naxal Bari movement broke out in 1967, it was a rebellion against the feudal nature of the society and against landlordism. These land related factors, which was affecting peasants, landless laborers, and farmers, it quickly spread to the forested heartland of India, where tribals were getting displaced and evicted because of government policies and environmental laws and projects. So, by utilizing that sentiment of the tribals and farmers and peasants, Maoists managed to indoctrinate and brainwash the masses and get some large scale support to prop up the Naxal movement against India. So, one of the root causes for the flourishing and sustenance of Maoism is the poor administration, lack of governance, and the corruption in the system, and the injustice which has also happened to some of the communities. Some of the grievances that the farmers, peasants, and tribals have, they are genuine. Genuine root causes has led to resentment, which has been exploited by the Maoists to indoctrinate the masses. So now the strategy would be to improve administration and governance in order to address the root cause. In fact, in the last 20 years, India has done pretty well to improve the administrative setup, to provide better infrastructure, create more opportunities in the Naxal belt. But now the question is, what will the government do in the tribal heartland of India? Because, see, there is a constitutional provision to ensure protection of tribal rights and ensure tribal welfare, which is the fifth schedule of the Indian Constitution and Article 244. Under the fifth schedule, there are special provisions carved out for scheduled areas which are notified by the president. In scheduled areas, the governor of that state gets special discretionary powers to look after tribal welfare and mainly to protect tribal land of forest dwelling tribes. The governor can take action and recommend policy changes to the state government, recommend to the president and the union government to ensure the welfare of tribals in that particular state. There is a tribal advisory council which will assist the governor to look at tribal welfare. The main focus is on protecting the livelihood of the tribals and ensuring their protection of their land in the forested areas, because many tribal communities are forest dwelling communities. But this article points out that failure of fifth schedule implementation has been one of the biggest reasons which has contributed to the rise of Maoism. So today, if India has to defeat Naxal ideology and the propaganda, we have to ensure effective implementation of fifth schedule. The fifth schedule is provided in 10 states where scheduled areas are notified by the president, like Andhra Pradesh, Telangana, Maharashtra, Chhattisgarh, and Jharkhand, etc. You can see the list given over here. These are the states where fifth schedule provisions are applicable. The sixth schedule, on the other hand, applies only for Assam, Meghalaya, Mizoram, and Tripura. Only for these four northeastern states where autonomous district councils are created. So the writer is arguing that if we have to ensure Naxalism doesn't revive itself, if we have to defeat the entire propaganda of the Maoists, we need to provide for better implementation of fifth schedule provisions, which has not happened on the ground. See, the PESA, the Panchayat Extension to Scheduled Areas Act, it did play a role in improving political representation for tribals in local administration. The PESA brought about decentralization of powers, which allowed Gram Panchayats, Gram Sabhas to play a bigger role. And it allowed the tribals to increase their political representation within the local bodies. But even the implementation of PESA has been haphazard in the tribal heartland of India. Then we had the Forest Rights Act of 2006, which recognized the legal rights of tribal communities over their land, their livelihood, and minor forest produce. It even recognized the community rights of the tribals. But these rights, which are guaranteed under law, they have not been implemented properly. Take, for example, the compensatory afforestation fund and the law with regard to compensatory afforestation. It has enabled the clearing of forest land in the name of protecting forests. Even forest dwelling tribes have been evicted on Supreme Court orders, which undermines the legal rights guaranteed under Forest Rights Act. So the writer is pointing out that the flawed implementation of fifth schedule provisions, PESA and Forest Rights Act is one of the reasons why there is underdevelopment, malgovernance in Naxal area. If we have to counter the ideology, we have to improve the implementation of these provisions, constitutional and legal provisions, and provide for better delivery of welfare and provide for securing of rights of the tribals. This is what is necessary to defeat Naxalism as an ideology. Coming to the next topic, there's an update on the extent of infiltration from Myanmar. Ever since Myanmar descended into civil war, there has been large scale infiltration of not just refugees, but illegal migrants as well. According to the border guarding force, Assam Rifles, 878 infiltrators have been held who were trying to cross over illegally from Myanmar to India. This highlights the security challenges that we face in border areas. It also shines some spotlight on the free movement regime, which has been blamed by the government of India to be responsible for enabling the easy movement of infiltrators in the Northeast region. The free movement regime previously allowed for visa free movement of people who are residing in 16 kilometers, in the area of 16 kilometers from the border, on both sides of the border. They would be given a travel document and it would facilitate cross border movement of the border dwelling population to enable local trade, to help families connect with each other, and to mark their cultural ties. So, the lack of regulation of free movement regime had contributed to the easy entry of illegal migrants and infiltrators, and insurgents and criminals would also misuse the route. So, especially after the Manipur violence in 2023, the Manipur ethnic violence broke out, which was linked with cross border factors. The government of India initially announced that we will suspend free movement regime. Home Minister Amit Shah made the announcement that we will end free movement regime and we are going to fence the entire border. So though government has started the fencing project has begun. It has been taken up by Assam Rifles, but FMR has not been suspended. It continues to exist even today in a different form. There have been new regulations and restrictions that are brought in. Instead of implementing FMR for 16 kilometers, it is now reduced to just 10 kilometers from the border. Free movement regime is applicable only for those villagers and residents who are present within 10 kilometers of the border, and even they have to undergo registration process. Whoever crosses the border, there is a biometric registration, they're issued passes, and there are designated points where they have to cross from India to Myanmar and vice versa. Previously, there were no such regulations. They could freely cross over anywhere, and the registration process was highly flawed. So those problems have been fixed. Around 43 entry exit points have been designated, which are controlled by Assam Rifles. Every person crossing through here will have to give their biometrics and get a pass, which allows them to cross the border. So this has been implemented to check the challenge of infiltration along India-Myanmar border. Now, coming to the prelim section, let's take a quick look and end the session after that. I'm sure all of you must be aware of the tragic incident that happened at a nightclub in Goa, a fire incident where many people lost their lives, and the owners of this nightclub, they fled to Thailand. So India has now managed to get them extradited from Thailand, and now they are under the custody of Goa police. So there is an important topic here. The Goa police coordinated with the CBI to get a blue corner notice issued against these individuals the moment they fled India and took shelter in Thailand. So what is this blue corner notice? It is one of the notices available under Interpol. Interpol provides for coordination between police and law enforcement agencies of the world. From India, CBI is the liaison authority to coordinate with Interpol. So all requests of state police will be channeled through the CBI. So there are different color coded notices that can be issued through Interpol, which mandates other members to cooperate with the country which has requested for these notices. You have red colored notice, yellow, blue, black, green, orange, purple, silver, and the UNSC special notice. They all serve a different purpose, and you can see that on the screen. I've added the image over here. So a blue notice requires the police of other countries to raise alerts and give information on a wanted individual. So when Goa police made the request through CBI, Thailand had to share additional information and further coordinate with the arrest and extradition, because India, Thailand, we have a mutual extradition treaty as well. So red corner notice is issued for wanted individuals or missing who are fugitives hiding in a different country. So these are the purposes of these color coded notices. So please make a note of this. This can come as a prelims topic. Next, India and Maldives have conducted their joint military exercise known as ECUVERIN. Indian Army and Maldivian National Defense Forces, they conduct this joint exercise called ECUVERIN, where India trains Maldivian forces and builds interoperability between the two armed forces. It's a long-standing military exercise between us. It highlights the close defense security ties between India and Maldives. Next, Indian Army has received the final batch of the Apache attack helicopters from Boeing. The Apache is one of the most advanced multi-role combat helicopters from the United States, designed, built, and manufactured by American defense giant, aerospace giant Boeing. So India had signed a contract in 2020 to procure around six Apache attack helicopters for the Indian Army. Some of you might be wondering why Army is procuring helicopters. Shouldn't it be the Air Force? See, that's because the Army has a dedicated aviation unit, the Army Aviation, which provides close support for ground troops and ground forces, for infantry, artillery units. There is close air support which is given during combat situations, and Army has its own Army Aviation wing. So these Apache helicopters have been procured specifically for the Indian Army. There is a separate order for Indian Air Force as well. So Boeing has been delivering them in batches one by one, and the order for Indian Army has now been completed. The final batch has been it has been sent to India and Indian Army will be inducting them into one of its squadrons based out of Jodhpur, which is a frontline base facing the western borders with Pakistan. Then coming to Article number 10, the Indian rupee continues to fall. It has breached the psychological mark of 91 against the US dollar, which makes rupee one of the weakest currencies in Asia as of today. So while some are expressing concern about this, the RBI, the government, and many experts, they say that there is no cause for alarm because the RBI doesn't want to intervene. Both RBI and government are confident about India's growth prospects, the low inflation which is present, and they also believe it's a temporary situation because there's a lot of uncertainty regarding India-US trade deal. It has been delayed. We've not been able to finalize the trade agreement. There is a fear of the impact of American tariffs, the 50% tariffs, and also the global uncertainty. It has led to a flight of foreign capital from India. So RBI and the government believe that there will be a correction which will happen naturally. And as of now, there's no need to press the panic button and unnecessarily intervene in the forex market. So RBI has allowed the market forces to play its role, and the position of the government is supported by experts as well. All economic experts agree that this is the right policy for us to allow the rupee to determine its value based on market standards. And there's no necessity for the RBI to intervene at this moment because they expect a correction to happen eventually. But however, it does raise concern for India's export competitiveness, import bill. So there are some worries. But as I said, RBI, government, and experts are reassuring the market that it is fine. These numbers are absolutely fine. Though this is the lowest ever the rupee has dropped to against the dollar. One last topic, the government is pushing for 100% FDI in the insurance sector. Now, this is going to be a very, very big change. The government has pushed a bill in the Lok Sabha, and once passed into a law, once the amendment is pushed through, it will allow for 100% FDI in the insurance market. So, this will help bring more foreign capital, foreign expertise to come out with better insurance products which can benefit the consumers. It will help widen the base of insurance in the country. Previously, 74% FDI was allowed in the insurance sector. Now the proposal is to push it to 100%, allow for 100% foreign participation to push for further reforms of the insurance industry. The bill also provides more regulatory authority and powers to IRDAI, the regulator of the insurance sector. So we will cover this in a more detailed analysis once the bill passes and there are more details available on the topic. So that is something you need to make a note of. So these are the 11 topics that were in the news. That's why I said this is going to be a comprehensive analysis covering almost every bit of the paper. So you don't have to go back and read the paper again. I hope you guys have liked the session, understood all the topics. If you benefited, please let me know in the comments and press the like button. And remember, tomorrow's session also is scheduled at 5 p.m. That is it. Thanks for watching. See you tomorrow.